You know what really got under my skin for years? I would spend all this time carefully air drying lumber in my shop, stickered it properly, kept it out of direct sun, waited patiently. And then I would build something for outdoor use, a garden gate, a bench, a set of planter boxes, and within 2 or 3 seasons, the rot would start creeping in. Drove me absolutely nuts. I tried different species, different finishes, even started brushing on commercial preservatives. Nothing gave me the kind of lasting durability I was after. Then one evening, I was reading about Viking shipbuilding, and I came across something that stopped me cold. These Norse shipwrights, before they ever shaped a plank for a longship, would take their freshly cut timber and sink it in the ocean. On purpose. They would leave it submerged in salt water for months, sometimes close to a year, before they ever touched it with a tool. And their ships survived Atlantic crossings, decades of hard use, and in some cases they are still intact over 1,000 years later. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly what they did, why it works, and how you can actually try a version of this in your own shop. Plus, stick around to the end, because I will show you a simple test that traditional Scandinavian boat builders still use today to know when the curing process is complete. Let me tell you, it is not what you would expect. So what we are really talking about here is saltwater curing. It is not some myth or legend. It is a well-documented timber preservation method with real science behind it, and it is directly relevant to anyone who has ever lost a project to rot or insect damage. Once you understand the logic, you start to wonder why more of us are not doing some version of this today. Let me give you some background on who these people were and why their methods deserve serious attention. The Norse, the people we often call Vikings, lived along the coastlines of Scandinavia, modern-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Their entire way of life depended on timber, ships, homes, storage buildings, bridges, sleds, tools. Wood was everything. And they lived in one of the harshest climates in Europe, cold, wet, and brutal on anything built from organic material. So they could not afford to have their timber fail. A ship that rotted through mid-voyage was not an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. What really impressed me when I started digging into this was how practical these people were. We tend to think of Vikings through this lens of mythology and drama, but when it comes to their craftsmanship, they were plain-spoken problem solvers. They looked at what was around them, which was an ocean full of cold salt water, and they figured out how to use it. The archaeological evidence backs this up. The Oseberg ship, discovered in Norway, dates to around 820 and is remarkably well preserved. The Gokstad ship is another example. Researchers studying these vessels found clear indicators that the timber had been treated before construction, and saltwater submersion fits the chemical profile perfectly. The guiding idea behind all of this is simple. Do not wait for wood to rot and then try to fix it. Remove the things that cause rot before you ever start building. That is the principle, and every method I'm about to share flows directly from it. The first thing the Norse understood, and this is where most of us already start going wrong, is that timber selection and preparation matter enormously. They primarily worked with oak for ship planking and structural members, though they also used pine and spruce for lighter components. But the critical factor was not just the species, it was the condition of the wood when it went into the water. They used green wood, freshly felled, full of moisture, with the cellular structure still wide open. This is the opposite of what most modern woodworkers aim for. We want our lumber dry before we do anything with it. But the Norse needed those cells open and saturated because that is what allows the saltwater exchange to happen. They also rived their timber rather than sawing it. Riving means splitting the log along the grain using wedges, which follows the natural fiber structure of the wood and leaves the cell walls largely intact. A sawn board cuts across fibers randomly, which disrupts the cellular pathways. A riven plank keeps those pathways continuous, and that turns out to be essential for allowing saltwater to penetrate evenly throughout the full thickness. They typically felled timber in late autumn or winter, when sap flow was at its lowest, which meant less sugar content to begin with. Smart. They were stacking the odds before the wood ever touched the sea. Now here is the part that fascinated me the most, the actual submersion process. The Norse would take their green, freshly rived planks and logs down to the coast, typically to a fjord or a sheltered tidal inlet. They weighted the timber with stones, or lashed it into bundles heavy enough to stay submerged, and they sank it in salt water, not stagnant water. Moving, tidal salt water, which turns out to be very important for the chemistry to work properly. The constant flow of fresh seawater ensures a steady supply of salt ions and prevents the buildup of anaerobic bacteria that could actually damage the wood. The duration varied depending on the species and the thickness of the timber. Oak planks of 1 to 2 inches thick might stay submerged for 3 to 6 months. Heavier structural timbers, the kind used for keels and ribs, could stay down for 8 to 12 months. The shipwrights checked their timber periodically. They would pull a test piece, cut into it, and look at the color and texture of the interior wood. When the heartwood had shifted from its original color to a more uniform, slightly darkened tone all the way through, they knew the exchange was progressing. There was no rushing this. The cold Scandinavian seawater actually slowed the process compared to warmer waters, but that slower exchange produced a more thorough and even result. Patience was built into the method. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these shipwright methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called Secrets of the Shipyard, and it covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that most woodworkers have never seen. 150 pages of real hands-on knowledge. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. So, what is actually happening inside the wood during all those months underwater? This is the part that turned my understanding of wood preservation on its head. The process is driven by osmosis. Freshly cut green wood is saturated with sap, which is essentially water loaded with dissolved sugars, starches, and organic compounds. Those sugars and starches are exactly what fungi and wood-boring insects feed on. They are a buffet for every organism that causes rot and decay. When that green wood is submerged in salt water, osmotic pressure takes over. The salt concentration outside the wood is much higher than the sugar and starch concentration inside the cells. So the dissolved organics gradually migrate out of the wood and salt ions migrate in. Over weeks and months, the salt water essentially flushes out the biological food supply and replaces it with sodium chloride and trace minerals. This is fundamentally different from simply soaking wood in water. Freshwater submersion can leach some sap, but it does not replace it with anything that inhibits decay. Saltwater does both. It removes the food source and deposits a natural preservative inside the cell structure. Modern wood scientists have confirmed this. Researchers at the University of Copenhagen and the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde have analyzed timbers from archaeological sites and found elevated salt concentrations deep within the cell walls, consistent with prolonged saltwater immersion. The chemistry is real, it is measurable, and it explains why these timbers lasted as long as they did. Once the submersion was complete, the Norse did not just pull the timber out and start building. They understood that the drying phase was just as critical. The salt-saturated planks were brought under cover and allowed to air dry slowly. And here is what surprised me when I first tried this on a small scale. Salt-saturated wood dries more evenly than untreated green wood. The salt crystals inside the cells actually regulate moisture loss by absorbing and releasing small amounts of humidity. The result is significantly less checking, less warping, and less of that internal stress that causes boards to cup and twist as they season. When the wood finally reaches equilibrium, those salt crystals remain embedded in the fiber structure. They make the wood inhospitable to fungi and insects essentially permanently, as long as the wood is not subjected to prolonged freshwater soaking that would leach the salt back out. The long-term results speak for themselves. Timbers from Viking-era structures and ships have shown remarkable resistance to both fungal decay and insect boring. Compare that to modern pressure-treated lumber, which relies on pushing chemical preservatives into wood under industrial pressure. The modern method works, but it uses compounds like copper azole or alkaline copper quaternary that many woodworkers prefer not to handle. The Norse method achieved similar or better results using nothing but seawater and time. Now here is the part I know you are wondering about. Can you actually do this at home? The answer is yes, with some honest caveats. I have experimented with this using a large galvanized stock tank, the kind you can pick up at any farm supply store. I mixed a saltwater solution using non-iodized sea salt at a concentration of roughly 3.5% by weight, which is close to average ocean salinity. That works out to about 1/3 of a pound of salt per gallon of water. I submerged freshly cut green oak boards about 3/4 of an inch thick and left them for 4 months, changing the water once a month to keep the salt concentration consistent. The results were genuinely encouraging. The boards dried flatter than any green oak I have ever air dried, and after 2 full seasons outdoors with no finish applied, there is zero sign of rot or insect activity. Now, the caveats. This works best with green wood. Kiln-dried or already seasoned lumber will not absorb the salt effectively because the cells have already collapsed. Thickness matters too. Anything over 2 inches is going to need significantly longer submersion time, and you need to keep the solution moving periodically, even just stirring it every few days, to prevent stagnation. It is not instant is gratification, but if you plan ahead, it is absolutely doable. Let me share some patterns I've noticed over the years, things I used to do myself that this tradition handles completely differently. The first pattern is relying entirely on kiln drying and assuming that is enough. Most of us think that once wood is dried to the right moisture content, it is ready for anything. But kiln drying does nothing to remove the sugars and starches inside the cells. It just removes water. The food supply for rot and insects is still sitting right there, waiting. The second pattern is treating rot as an afterthought. We build something, put it outdoors, and then react when decay appears. We brush on sealers or preservatives after the fact. The Norse approach is the opposite. Address the cause of rot before you ever cut a joint. The third pattern is rushing the seasoning process. We want lumber ready now. The Norse were willing to wait a year for properly cured timber because they knew the alternative was rebuilding in 3 years. That patience paid for itself many times over. The fourth pattern is assuming that modern chemical treatments are the only option for outdoor durability. They work, but they are not the only path. A method that is over 1,000 years old and uses nothing but salt water deserves a place in the conversation. Now, for that bonus tip I promised. This one comes from traditional boat builders in Western Norway who still practice saltwater curing today. When they want to check whether the sap exchange is complete, they use a method that made me laugh the first time I saw it. They cut a small sliver from the center of the thickest piece of submerged timber, and they taste it. If it tastes distinctly salty all the way through, the exchange has reached the core. If the center still tastes bland or slightly sweet, it needs more time. They also check density. A properly cured piece will feel noticeably heavier than a matched green sample that was simply air-dried because the salt deposited inside the cells adds measurable weight. I started doing both of these checks on my stock tank experiments, and they are remarkably reliable. Simple, no equipment needed, and it tells you exactly what you need to know. Now, if this kind of traditional shipwright knowledge is something you want to keep learning from, I have written a guide called Secrets of the Shipyard. It covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that have been perfected over centuries. The kind of stuff you will not find in most modern woodworking books. Scan the QR code right now or check the first link below. All right, let us continue. I hope this one opened your eyes the way it opened mine. Sometimes the best woodworking wisdom is not in the newest product on the shelf. It is in the oldest methods we forgot to ask about. Thanks for spending this time with me, and I will see you in the next one.